Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, where in Season 9, Episode 6, we plunge into Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern World History, 5th edition, to confront one of humanity's most devastating conflicts, examining its rapid expansion, crucial turning points, and the horrifying depths of human brutality. So this isn't just a dry recounting of facts for you. Instead, we're embarking on a deep dive into the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale of the Second World War. We'll be exploring those surprising moments that shifted the tide and really grappling with the profound moral questions this conflict forced upon humanity. And just so you know, everything we're discussing today comes directly from Lowe's Mastering Modern World History, giving us a structured yet incredibly rich look at this pivotal period.
Exactly. And it's quite a journey we're taking. We'll trace the conflict from the lightning-fast Blitzkrieg that, well, shocked the world, right? Through its global expansion into a truly worldwide struggle. Then we'll analyze the critical shifts in momentum that finally turned the tide and confront some of the most chilling aspects of human cruelty revealed during this period. It's pretty heavy stuff. Finally, we'll look at the war's far-reaching consequences that fundamentally shape the modern world as we know it. Lowe actually structures this conflict into 4 distinct phases, which we'll explore before moving into its most brutal depths and lasting impacts.
Okay, let's unpack this with Phase 1. The opening Blitzkrieg in Britain stands alone. This covers September 1939 to December 1940. When Germany invaded Poland, it was just this terrifying demonstration of their lightning war, Blitzkrieg. Imagine rapid thrusts by motorized divisions and tanks. The Panzers is all backed up by air power from the Luftwaffe. Their goal was basically to cripple Poland's infrastructure, its railway system, its air force, and they did it devastatingly fast. It's such a stark image from history, isn't it? Polish cavalry, with lances, bravely but just hopelessly charging German tanks. Poland fell swiftly, divided with the USSR as per their pact, while Britain and France, well, they offered minimal direct help.
Yeah, and after Poland, things went quiet in the West for about 5 months. It was this period the American press famously called the phony war. But what was phony in the West certainly wasn't in the East. Russia used this time to absorb the Baltic states and even invaded Finland to grab some defensive territory. Meanwhile, in the West, French and German forces just kind of sat there, manning their Maginot and Siegfried lines. Lowe suggests Hitler hoped this lull would, weaken Anglo-French resolve, maybe push them towards negotiating peace, which ironically actually pleased his generals who weren't convinced the German army was even ready for a Western attack yet. Shows a real miscalculation on Hitler's part, I think.
That uneasy calm was totally shattered in April 1940 with Germany's invasion of Denmark and Norway. And this wasn't just random. There were clear strategic reasons, right? Germany needed to secure its vital Swedish iron ore supply, which came through the Norwegian port of Narvik. Britain was already interfering with that trade. Plus, Admiral Raeder, the German Navy chief, he saw Norway's fjords as these excellent naval bases for attacking Britain's supply lines across the Atlantic. There was this specific incident, too, the Altmark incident, where a British destroyer rescued prisoners from a German ship in a Norwegian fjord. That apparently spurred Hitler to act. So German troops landed, caught the Norwegians by surprise, and they were even aided by local Nazis under Vidkun Quisling.
Yeah, the Norwegian campaign, well, it secured Germany's resources in those naval bases, but it came at a cost. Germany lost several crucial cruisers and destroyers. That actually impacted their naval strength later on. But more importantly for Britain, this whole thing showed Chamberlain's government was frankly incompetent. He was forced to resign, and Winston Churchill became prime minister. And Lowe really emphasizes that Churchill brought this vital sense of urgency, this drive, and the ability to unite his cabinet. Exactly what Britain desperately needed right then. So the insight from Lowe's here is that this seemingly minor campaign sparked a really critical shift in British leadership. Indispensable, really.
Okay, so then the Blitzkrieg turns its focus west, hitting Holland, Belgium, and France, all starting in May 1940. The victories were just shockingly swift. Holland surrendered in only 4 days after Rotterdam was bombed, killing nearly 1,000 civilians. Just awful. Belgium held out longer, but when it surrendered, it exposed the Allied troops, leaving them perilously close to being cut off as German tanks swept across northern France. Only Dunkirk remained in Allied hands. And as Lowe details, the British Navy played an absolutely vital role in that evacuation, saving over 338,000 troops from the beaches, 2/3 British, all under constant Luftwaffe attack. And it's still debated why, but Hitler made that controversial halt order on May 24th, stopping the advance towards Dunkirk.
Dunkirk was, a truly mixed bag. It rescued a huge number of Allied troops, which definitely boosted British morale, the whole Dunkirk spirit. But it was a severe blow militarily. All the heavy equipment was left behind. And France itself, Well, it fell with shocking speed, surrendering just weeks later. Lowe points to several reasons. France was psychologically unprepared, deeply divided. Politically, you had fascists on the right, communists against the war, and militarily weak. Their reliance on the static Maginot Line was disastrous. It didn't cover the Belgian border, which is exactly where the Germans broke through. Their tanks were dispersed, unlike Germany's concentrated forces, and they'd neglected air support. Plus, fatal mistakes by French generals, poor communication. The insight here is France's swift defeat wasn't just military failure, it was a whole societal and leadership crisis compounding their tactical errors.
Right. And this opening phase culminates in the Battle of Britain, fought entirely in the air, August-September 1940. Göring's Luftwaffe tried to destroy the RAF, the Royal Air Force, basically clearing the way for a full-scale invasion of Britain. They bombed harbors, radar stations, airfields, munitions factories, and then eventually switched to bombing London. But the RAF inflicted significantly heavier losses, shooting down nearly double the number of German planes compared to their own losses. When it became clear British air power wasn't destroyed, Hitler called off the invasion plan, Operation Sea Lion. British success came down to a few things: those new radar stations giving early warning, German bomber weaknesses, and crucially, that German mistake of switching targets to London. It actually relieved pressure on the vital British airfields at just the right moment.
Absolutely. The Battle of Britain was without doubt the first major turning point of the war. It completely shattered the myth of German invincibility. It showed, for the first time, that they could actually be stopped. And by keeping Britain in the war, it forced Hitler into that fatal situation of a two-front war, which he'd face head-on when he attacked Russia. It's why Churchill's famous tribute resonates so deeply, isn't it? Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. And it also sort of highlighted Mussolini's struggles. His invasions of Egypt and Greece, they basically turned him into an embarrassment to Hitler, as Lowe puts it.
Okay, so from there, the Axis offensive widens. We're moving into Phase 2, 1941 to the summer of 1942. And this is where, tragically, the depths of human brutality really start to emerge more clearly. Hitler's first moves in 41 were basically propping up Italy. He sent Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps to North Africa. They pushed the British all the way back to El Alamein in Egypt. He also invaded Greece in April 41, forcing the British and Commonwealth troops to evacuate from both Greece and Crete. The conflict was definitely widening.
Yeah, the Greek campaigns were certainly depressing for the Allies, lost a lot of men, weakened their forces in North Africa. But what's fascinating, as Lowe points out, is the unintended consequence for Hitler. His getting bogged down in Greece and Yugoslavia might have delayed Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, by maybe 5 crucial weeks. If that invasion had started earlier, say in May, the Germans might well have captured Moscow before that brutal Russian winter hit. It could have potentially altered the entire course of the Eastern Front. It's a huge historical what-if.
Definitely. And speaking of Russia, Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion, kicked off June 22, 1941. Hitler's motives were complex, weren't they? Fear of a Russian attack while he was busy in the West, hoping Japan would attack Russia in the Far East. But above all, it was his visceral hatred of communism and that fanatical desire for Lebensraum, living space in the East. Historians like Alan Bullock argue Hitler always intended to establish his thousand-year Reich by taking territory basically between the Vistula and the Urals. He expected a quick win, famously told a general, "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." Overconfidence, maybe?
Massive overconfidence. He launched a truly awesome attack. Millions of men, thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft. 3 main prongs aimed at Leningrad, Moscow, and the Ukraine. And the Russians were caught completely off guard, despite warnings from Britain and America. Stalin, maybe trusting the Nazi-Soviet pact too much, or maybe because of his purges of the military leadership, just didn't believe the intelligence. But the Germans failed to capture Leningrad and Moscow. They got seriously hampered by heavy October rains, turning roads into just impassable mud. And then came the severe frosts in November and December, down to minus 38 Celsius. The Germans just didn't have adequate winter clothing because Hitler expected it all to be over by autumn. That miscalculation was profoundly consequential. Nature became Russia's unexpected ally.
Wow. And then another massive shift. The USA enters the war in December 1941, triggered by Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan's motives were largely economic, right? They needed raw materials, rubber, oil, tin from British Malaya, Burma, the Dutch East Indies. Tensions with the U.S. had been escalating. America was supporting China. And then when Japan occupied French Indochina, Roosevelt hit them with a crucial oil embargo. Negotiations failed, and when the aggressive General Tosho became prime minister in October 41, war seemed pretty much inevitable.
And the Pearl Harbor attack itself was, from a military perspective, brilliantly organized. No declaration of war. Hundreds of Japanese planes arrive undetected. In just 2 hours, they destroy hundreds of U.S. aircraft, sink or damage 5 battleships, inflict thousands of casualties. It led to Roosevelt's famous declaration of a date which will live in infamy, the immediate result. Japan rapidly gains control over vast areas of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, securing those vital resources. But here's the thing. While it was a devastating tactical victory for Japan, it was a massive strategic blunder. It pulled the U.S. fully into the war, united the American public like nothing else could.
Absolutely. And here's where it gets really interesting and possibly shows Hitler's flawed strategic thinking again. He then made what Lowe's and many historians argue was his single most catastrophic error, declaring war on the USA after Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Congress was actually focused on revenge against Japan. They were pretty reluctant to get deeply involved in Europe. Hitler's declaration basically saved Roosevelt the trouble of persuading Congress to go to war with Germany. Why would he do that?
It's baffling strategically. The consequence was immense. Germany now faced the combined potential industrial military manpower of the USA, the USSR, and the British Commonwealth. Lowe concludes pretty starkly that the longer the war lasted, the less chance there was of an Axis victory. They desperately needed quick knockout blows before America's full industrial might could be mobilized. Hitler's decision just shifted the balance of power irrevocably against them.
Okay, and as the conflict widened, this is where the horrifying depths of human brutality truly come to the fore in Lowe's account. He reveals just ruthless, brutal behavior by both Germans and Japanese in the territories they conquered. For the Nazis, their treatment of Eastern European peoples was horrific. They viewed them as subhumans, Untermenschen, fit only to be slaves for the German master race. And for Jewish people, the explicit goal became extermination.
William Shirer's words, quoted by Lowe, paint a chilling picture. Nazi degradation sank to a level seldom experienced by man in all his time on Earth. Quote, millions of decent, innocent men and women were driven into forced labor, millions were tortured in the concentration camps, and millions more still, including nearly 6 million Jews, were massacred in cold blood or deliberately starved to death and their remains burned. What's particularly insightful, or maybe horrifyingly cynical, is that Lowe points out this brutality wasn't just amoral, it was strategically stupid. It alienated potential allies in places like the Baltic states and Ukraine, who initially might have welcomed liberation from Stalin, but were then treated abysmally by the Nazis.
And similarly, the Japanese showed immense brutality towards prisoners of war and other Asian peoples in their occupied territories. They had this ambition to organize a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, and initially some Asians did see them as liberators from European colonial rule. But the harshness of Japanese treatment quickly turned that initial welcome into determined resistance movements, often with communist involvement.
Right. So that brings us to Phase 3. The tide turns Allied offensives held in check. This is roughly summer 1942 to summer 1943. This period saw 3 really crucial battles where Axis forces were decisively defeated and began to lose ground. Midway Island, El Alamein, and Stalingrad. These weren't just tactical wins, they represented a fundamental shift in the war's momentum.
Okay, let's start with Midway, June 1942, in the Pacific. The Americans scored a critical victory, even though they were numerically inferior to the Japanese fleet, weren't they?
They were. Japan had more carriers, more warships. But the crucial American advantage was intelligence. They'd broken the Japanese naval code, so they knew exactly when and where the attack was coming. Allowed them to set a trap, basically. The Japanese, probably overconfident after their early successes, made 2 fatal mistakes, according to Lowe's. They split their forces, letting the Americans concentrate on the main carrier group, and they launched aircraft from all 4 carriers at once. This meant when those planes were returning and needed rearming and refueling, the carrier decks were packed, incredibly vulnerable. American dive bombers hit them at that exact moment, sinking 4 Japanese carriers and hundreds of planes. Midway crippled Japanese naval air power. It was huge.
Wow, timing is everything. Okay, next, El Alamein, October 1942, in North Africa. Rommel's Africa Corps, having pushed deep into Egypt, gets driven back decisively by Montgomery's British Eighth Army. How did the Allies pull that off?
Well, massive reinforcements arrived during a 7-week pause. Montgomery ended up with far more troops and tanks than Rommel. Plus, crucial Allied air power was constantly hitting Axis supply ships crossing the Mediterranean. Rommel faced severe shortages, food, fuel, ammo, and Montgomery himself was meticulous in his preparations. He didn't rush.
So El Alamein wasn't just about stopping Rommel.
No, it was another huge turning point. It prevented Egypt and the Suez Canal from falling to Germany, which would have been catastrophic for Britain. It ended any chance of an Axis link-up in the Middle East, and it led directly to the Axis being completely kicked out of North Africa by May 43. Hundreds of thousands of German and Italian troops surrendered in Tunisia. It also drained German resources badly needed back in Russia.
And then the third big one, Stalingrad, August 42 to February 43. The German southern advance reached Stalingrad on the Volga. The Russians refused to surrender, even though the city was basically destroyed block by block. Then the Russians launched this ferocious counterattack in November, trapping the entire German Sixth Army under General von Paulus. Supply lines cut, freezing winter. Eventually, tens of thousands of German soldiers were forced to surrender. Just a disaster for Germany.
An absolute catastrophe.
Yeah.
Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility on land, just like Midway did at sea and the Battle of Britain in the air. It stopped the Germans from cutting Russia's vital oil supply from the Caucasus. It forced them to ditch plans to attack Moscow from the southeast. It massively boosted Russian morale, fueled their counterattacks, and really marked the beginning of the long, bloody German retreat from Russia, which was complete by 1944. Stalingrad was just pivotal.
And during this whole phase, we shouldn't forget the role of Allied naval and air power, should we? Especially the Battle of the Atlantic, that fight against the German U-boats. The Allies initially took huge losses, right, peaking in March 43. But they eventually turned the tide. Lowe mentions more air cover from long-range planes, better escort tactics, and crucially, the introduction of new centimetric radar sets on aircraft, allowing them to spot surfaced U-boats.
Absolutely. Lowe argues that victory in the Battle of the Atlantic was just as important as Midway, El Alamein, and Stalingrad. Britain simply couldn't have stayed in the war without controlling those Atlantic supply lines, full stop. And Allied air power more broadly was vital everywhere. Winning the Battle of Britain, working with the Navy to sink ships like the Bismarck, dominating the Pacific War, supporting ground troops in the desert, enabling airborne ops. Air and sea power were the unsung heroes, the foundation for everything else.
Okay, Phase 4. The final push and controversial endings. July 1943 to August 1945. The Axis collapse really begins with Italy falling, doesn't it? Allied landings in Sicily in July 43 lead to Mussolini being dismissed. Allied troops cross to the Italian mainland, but German resistance is surprisingly fierce. It drags on until April 1945, tying up German troops needed elsewhere.
Yeah, that Italian campaign sets the stage for Operation Overlord, D-Day, June 6, 1944.
Yeah.
The second front the Russians had been demanding for years. The timing was strategic. Italy was out. U-boats were largely contained. Allied air superiority was overwhelming. The landings themselves were just massive. Amphibious assaults on a 60-mile stretch of Normandy beaches. Incredible logistics involved, too. Those prefabricated Mulberry harbors towed across the channel, the Pluto pipelines for fuel. Eventually, millions of Allied troops poured in, liberating northern France, Paris by August 44, and taking out those German V-1 and V-2 missile sites hitting Britain. D-Day was a triumph of planning and brute force.
But this is also where that controversial policy of unconditional surrender comes into play, isn't it? Roosevelt announced it way back in January 43. Germany, Italy, Japan had to surrender without conditions. Lowe points out this dismayed Churchill and some British intelligence people who were secretly hoping to negotiate with German resistance groups if Hitler was overthrown. Even Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, was apparently delighted. He supposedly said, "I should never have been able to think up so rousing a slogan." It basically told the Germans they had no choice but to fight to the death.
Exactly. And Lowe highlights the ongoing debate about this. Many leading Americans, including General Eisenhower, actually opposed it. They thought it would just prolong the war, cost more lives unnecessarily. They tried to get Roosevelt to change his mind before D-Day, but he refused. Feared it would look like weakness. Truman continued the policy after Roosevelt died. Thomas Fleming calculated that nearly 2 million people died between D-Day and August 45. He argues many of those lives could perhaps have been saved if a negotiated peace had been possible. He called it an ultimatum written in blood. So while it sounds morally clear-cut, its strategic wisdom and human costs are still heavily debated.
Yeah, that's heavy. And the final assault on Germany itself saw disagreements too, didn't it? Between Montgomery and Eisenhower. Montgomery wanted a quick single thrust to Berlin to beat the Russians there. Eisenhower favored a slower, cautious, broad front advance. The British failure at Arnhem and Holland seemed to support Eisenhower's caution. But this dispersal of Allied troops maybe allowed Hitler to launch his last desperate offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, in December 44. It got the Allies by surprise initially, but ultimately it just cost Germany hundreds of thousands of irreplaceable men and tanks.
And that raises the haunting question. Why did the Germans keep fighting right to the bitter end when the war was clearly lost? Adam Tooze suggests a large part of German society was just completely committed to the war effort, but Ian Kershaw, cited by Lowe, really emphasizes the nature of the Nazi regime itself and Hitler's irrational belief in total victory or total destruction. No compromise possible in his mind. Plus, there was fear of the enemy, especially the Russians after Nazi propaganda about them, and sheer terror from within the Nazi regime itself. Officials were hanging or shooting defeatists, bullying the civilian population into compliance. It was the regime's nature, fueled by Hitler's will and maintained by terror, that forced Germany to fight to its own annihilation.
And the war finally ends with Japan's defeat. On August 6, 1945, the U.S. drops the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Tens of thousands killed instantly. 3 days later, a second bomb on Nagasaki. Tens of thousands more killed. Japan surrenders. The use of these bombs, still one of the most controversial acts of the entire war.
Massively controversial. President Truman justified it by saying it saved American lives by ending the war quickly, avoiding a bloody invasion of Japan. But many historians argue it wasn't necessary. Japan had apparently already put out peace feelers in July through Russia. A significant counter-argument, mentioned by Lowe, suggests the real reasons might have been more geopolitical. Maybe ending the war swiftly before the Soviets gained too much territory in Asia, and demonstrating America's awesome new power to Stalin in the USSR. So the bombs ended the war, yes, but the debate about their necessity, their morality, their true purpose, that continues, and it certainly shaped the post-war world.
So wrapping up the why did the Axis ultimately lose?
Yeah.
Lowe lays out several key reasons. Shortage of raw materials was huge, especially for Italy and Japan. Germany ran critically low on oil by mid-1944. Also, the Allies learned from their mistakes. They figured out how to counter Blitzkrieg, developed air and naval superiority that slowly choked the Axis.
And the Axis powers just took on too much, didn't they? Hitler underestimated Britain, Russia, America, spread his forces way too thin. Japan did the same in the Pacific, stretching beyond their capacity. Mussolini's military failures were a constant drain on Hitler, too. But maybe the biggest factor was just the overwhelming combined resources of the Allies, the USA, the USSR, the British Empire. By 1945, Russian tank numbers dwarfed Germany's. American industry was churning out planes and tanks at an unbelievable rate. The Axis just couldn't compete long term. Plus, those huge tactical mistakes by the leaders, Hitler's two-front war, the winter campaign failure, declaring war on the U.S., Japan focusing too much on battleships early on. And finally, that Nazi racial policy, treating conquered people so brutally alienated potential allies. Their own ideology helped sow the seeds of their defeat.
Okay, now we need to turn to something Lowe covers in detail, a truly horrifying shadow cast by this conflict, the Holocaust. As Allied armies pushed into Germany and Poland, they started making these horrifying discoveries. Like at the end of July 1944, Soviet forces uncovered the extermination camp at Majdanek near Lublin. They found hundreds of unburied corpses, 7 gas chambers. The photos taken there were the first real proof the outside world saw of these horrors. It's just beyond words.
The scale of the final solution, the Endlösung, as the Nazis called it, was just staggering. Over 1.5 million people murdered at Majdanek alone. Mostly Jews, but also Soviet POWs, Poles. Lowe states that from December 1941, when the first killings started at Chelmno, to May 1945, some 5.7 million Jews were murdered. Alongside them, hundreds of thousands of non-Jews, Roma, socialists, communists, homosexuals, the mentally handicapped. It was systematic industrial-scale murder, almost incomprehensible.
Which leads to that profound, awful question. How could something like this happen? Was it just the culmination of centuries of anti-Semitism in Germany? Was it Hitler's direct plan all along? Or did the war itself force it? Historians debate this, the intentionalists, who see it as Hitler's long-term plan, versus the functionalists, who argue war circumstances sort of forced the final solution onto the regime, sometimes linked to the weak dictator idea. Lowe does note that most writers who try to deny or minimize the Holocaust have been largely discredited. So what are the core arguments historians grapple with here?
Well, the functionalist view often points to how the war itself worsened the situation. Invading Poland, then the USSR, brought millions more Jews under Nazi control. This created this awful pressure of numbers in ghettos like Warsaw, which were horribly overcrowded. Tens of thousands died just from disease and starvation there. Some functionalists, like Hans Mommsen, suggested Hitler was maybe a weak dictator in some ways, responding to demands from local officials dealing with these ghettos. But Ian Kershaw offers a more nuanced take, I think. He talks about Hitler's personalized rule, inviting radical initiatives from below, meaning subordinates would anticipate Hitler's broad aims, working towards the Führer, as Kershaw puts it, and take action, even without explicit orders for every detail. So the insight isn't that Hitler wasn't responsible, but that the Holocaust was this horrific combination of ideology, bureaucracy, and these initiatives from below, all ultimately stemming from Hitler's will.
Alan Bullock, another historian Lowe mentions, tries to synthesize both views. He suggests Hitler was committed to destroying Jewish power early on, but the exact how was maybe vague at first. Hitler was a shrewd politician, sensitive to public opinion. Initially, he didn't push too far. The Nuremberg laws, Kristallnacht. When Kristallnacht got bad press, he shifted focus to forced emigration, seizing assets, even bizarre plans like deporting Jews to Madagascar.
The radical shift, Lowe argues, really came with the invasion of Russia in June 1941. That wasn't just seen as war, but as an ideological war of destruction. Conventional rules didn't apply. War conditions also meant Jews couldn't emigrate anymore. The decision for the final solution itself was likely made in autumn 1941, probably driven by early German victories boosting Hitler's confidence and the fact they could now carry it out far from German public view, and the implementation was immediate. SS Einsatzgruppen units, even the regular army, began rounding up and murdering communists and Jews in mass shootings like the 34,000 at Babi Yar near Kyiv, 75,000 near Odessa. The invasion unleashed unrestrained genocidal violence.
Then, in January 1942, came the Wannsee Conference. Not to decide on the final solution, but to coordinate the logistics of removing and transporting up to 11 million Jews across Europe. Initially, maybe focused on forced labor leading to death by starvation and exhaustion, but it quickly shifted to just systematic, outright destruction. Hitler wasn't even at Wannsee, which some have used to try and deflect blame from him, but historians like Kershaw conclude his role was absolutely decisive and indispensable. What does Wannsee tell us about the, bureaucratic coldness of it all?
It's chilling. The details of the genocide are just harrowing. Jews were transported in cattle cars to dedicated extermination camps like Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and the most infamous Auschwitz-Birkenau. By the end of 1942 alone, Lowe estimates over 4 million Jews had been killed. And even as Germany was clearly losing the war, Hitler insisted the program continue relentlessly. Alan Bullock's description of arrival at the camps is visceral. Doctors making split-second life-death selections. The victims stripped naked, possessions taken, herded into gas chambers. Bullock writes, "When the screaming died down and the doors were opened, they were still standing upright, so tightly packed that they could not fall." It's this horrifying mix of cold bureaucracy and utter dehumanizing cruelty, continuing even as the Third Reich crumbled.
So the awful question remains, what sort of people could commit such crimes? Daniel Goldhagen's controversial book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, argued for a unique kind of German anti-Semitism leading to collective responsibility. Michael Burley partially supports this idea.
Lowe suggests Goldhagen might go too far, but he does indicate that large numbers of ordinary Germans willingly went along. Himmler himself gave chilling justifications like, "We had the moral right to destroy this people which wanted to destroy us." The SS, the Gestapo, camp guards, the Wehrmacht, even businessmen profiting from slave labor, doctors conducting experiments, they were all deeply implicated. And crucially, Lowe points out, collaboration wasn't just German. Many Polish and Soviet citizens participated, sometimes brutally. Romanian leader Ion Antonescu willingly joined the genocide. However, Lowe emphasizes, without Hitler and the Nazis to provide the authority, the legitimacy, the backing, and the drive, none of this would have been possible. It needed that Nazi state apparatus to happen on that scale.
But amidst all that darkness, it's so important to remember the counterpoint Lowe also brings up. Many courageous Germans and Poles risk everything, their lives, their families, to help Jews, hiding them, organizing escape routes. Many ended up in concentration camps themselves for doing so. Research suggests maybe tens of thousands of decent and honest people in Warsaw alone were involved in assisting Jews, challenging that idea of universal compliance or indifference. There were acts of incredible bravery.
Absolutely. Now, shifting to the post-war world, the transformations brought about by WWII were just monumental. First, the sheer destruction. Almost 40 million people killed globally, over half of them Russians. 6 million Poles, 4 million Germans, millions of Chinese and Japanese. Britain and the USA, as Lowe notes, got off comparatively lightly in terms of direct casualties, though the impact was still huge.
And beyond the death toll, you had tens of millions uprooted. Slave laborers freed, concentration camp survivors, refugees fleeing armies, a massive post-war repatriation problem. Huge parts of Germany were just rubble. Western Russia was devastated, maybe 25 million homeless. France lost nearly half its national wealth. The physical scars were immense.
And unlike WWI, there was no single big peace settlement like Versailles afterwards. Why? Mainly because that deep distrust between the USSR and the West reemerged almost immediately as the war ended, making broad agreement impossible. It led straight into the Cold War. The war did stimulate social changes, though, urban redevelopment in ruined cities. And in Britain, things like the Beveridge Report laid the foundations for the modern welfare state.
And then there's the chilling legacy. Nuclear weapons. Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated their horrifying power. It left the world under this unprecedented threat of global annihilation, which paradoxically also acted as a terrifying deterrent throughout the Cold War.
And the war completely reshaped global power. Europe's centuries of domination over. Western European states like Germany were devastated. France and Italy were basically bankrupt. Britain, though victorious, was financially ruined, deeply in debt to the USA. Europe was diminished.
Which led directly to the emergence of the superpowers, the USA and the USSR. The USA came out relatively unscathed, even prosperous from supplying the Allies. It had the world's biggest navy, air force, and initially a monopoly on the atomic bomb. The USSR, though terribly weakened, had the largest army in the world occupying Eastern Europe. Despite being wartime allies against Hitler, their mutual suspicion quickly hardened. And that tension became, as Lowe puts it, the most important feature of international relations for almost half a century after 1945, the Cold War.
And finally, decolonization. The war massively accelerated it. The defeats Japan inflicted on Britain, Holland, and France in Asia shattered the myth of European invincibility. Asian peoples had fought to remove the Japanese. They weren't about to willingly go back under European rule. This sparked independence movements across Asia, which then spread to Africa and the Middle East. It gave rise to the third world of non-aligned nations, completely changing the global map. The war, perhaps unintentionally, broke the back of colonialism.
This deep dive really hammers home the sheer scale of the Second World War, doesn't it? From that rapid, brutal expansion to the surprising pivotal turning points, right through to the horrifying depths of human brutality it unleashed.
Absolutely. Lowe's material makes it incredibly clear that WWII wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a catalyst for these profound shifts in global power, in moral boundaries, even in our understanding of humanity. When you confront the full spectrum of its events, from the strategic blunders like Hitler declaring war on the U.S. to the systematic atrocities of the Holocaust, it really compels you to ask, what do these moments reveal about humanity's capacity for both immense cruelty and sometimes surprising resilience? And how do those lessons continue to echo in our world today?
A powerful question to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Lowe's perspective on World War II. We encourage you to continue exploring this crucial and often dark period of history.